Hello! So, I'm a day late on this. Today we're going to start our Introduction to the Psychology of Animal Training, in which I will be talking about psychological theories behind common animal training techniques and methods, and essentially whether or not the psychology is solid. Animal training also uses a lot of psychological terms, so we'll be going over those and how correctly or incorrectly the animal training is using them, things like that. So, bit of housekeeping first. I have added Substack to my social media list. Substack I'm intending it to be my Substack account will be an extension of the YouTube account. So if you have a video that you are interested in, but watching videos isn't really your thing, you can follow the link to my Substack where there will be, it won't be quite an exact transcript of the video, but essentially a transcript of the video. And you can read if you would prefer. So, that link will be down in the caption section, and let's get started. So, the first thing that I want to talk about is some of the most common verbiage that you will hear with animal training and the verbiage that I will be using. So we're going to get these definitions out of the way so that when you hear me say these things, you know what I'm talking about. So the first thing we're going to talk about is behavior modification. Now you can probably see I have it written down twice. That is because behavior modification is often an umbrella term that will encompass all of the things that we're going to talk about. That is probably the most common use of it, is this umbrella term. However, I also use it in a different way, which we're going to talk about. So, behavior modification is exactly what it sounds like. We are modifying or changing behaviors. When I am looking at training an animal, I start by breaking it down into 3 different types of training goals. We have cue behaviors, which is, for instance, like obedience classes. This is your very simple, I say sit, the dog sits, right? In cue behaviors, we are mostly focused on essentially teaching our dog another language, right? We're teaching them our language and what our language means, right? So what does the word sit mean? And then we're reinforcing those behaviors so that the dog knows what the word means and then does what we're asking with that word. These are basic cue behaviors. What we are not addressing, that we would address in behavior or emotional modification, is changing an animal's reaction to a situation, or changing their feelings around a situation. Changing a dog's reaction or an animal's reaction to a situation is what I refer to as behavior modification. So, again, behavior modification is an umbrella term. This is behavior modification as a specific term, a more specific term, where my goal is to change an animal's reaction to a situation. It is different, but often overlaps with emotional modification. But it's different because in behavior modification, as a specific term, I'm not necessarily trying to address or change the animal's feelings around a situation. I am only trying to change how they react to that situation. We often use operant conditioning as a form of behavior modification. We'll talk more about operant conditioning in a second. One example of behavior modification that I have done with my horse is through the Tristan Tucker training method, in which when my horse gets nervous, I have trained her to go in a circle around me. So I have not attempted to address the nervousness. I'm not trying to change her nervousness or stop her from being nervous. I'm merely telling her, when you get nervous, this is how you should behave. That's it. Another term that you could use with this is communication modification would be another really great term, in which I'm not teaching her how to feel. I'm teaching her simply how to communicate her feelings to me, which is behavior. Behavior is inherently communication. So that's behavior communication modification. Emotional modification is what we do when we want to change how an animal feels about a situation. This would be something like desensitizing, or if you've heard of the BAT training protocol for reactive dogs, those fall under emotional modification, where we're attempting to redefine and give the animal different feelings about a certain situation rather than just changing their behavior, right? So in behavior modification, we are only addressing how the animal reacts or how the animal behaves with those feelings or communicates those feelings to us. In emotional modification, we are attempting to change the emotions and the feelings. As you can probably guess, these have a lot of overlap. And some of the things that we'll talk about, like operant conditioning and classical conditioning, can really be used for multiples of these or for different stages of each of these. For instance, cue behaviors with clicker training uses classical conditioning first and then the clicker as part of the cue behavior training, right? So there's a ton of overlap. I'm going to try my best to put these in different categories for now, because I think it's easiest to think of them in different categories first. And then once you kind of have an understanding of that, then you can see and use more how they overlap with each other and how they work together. So let's go and talk about some of these other terms that I've used, like operant conditioning and desensitization, more in depth. So I've made this little graphic here where I did my best to put each of the terms that we're going to use into a category. We're going to start with cue behaviors. So some positive reinforcement training will fit under cue behaviors. I mostly needed something to go in there. So with positive reinforcement, this is how we teach sit. We teach them sit. They learn how to sit. We give them a treat when they sit when we say sit. Simple. Easy peasy. That's a cue behavior training method. What positive reinforcement falls under is what we call operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, along with classical conditioning, was really popular in the late 1800s, very late 1800s to early 1900s, and those two were the basis for what a school of thought within psychology called behaviorism. Behaviorism was also very popular in the 1900s before, and it kind of preceded a little bit what we have today, which is cognitive psychology. So anyway, that's just a little background. So operant conditioning has essentially 4 quadrants along 2 axes, right? So the first axis is going to be on one side we have positive, on the other side we have negative, and on the other axes we have punishment and we have reinforcement. And so one of the things that's important to note about these is that these are psychological terms. And so positive and negative do not necessarily mean good or bad in the case of operant conditioning. Positive means that we are adding a stimulus or a thing. So treats are a stimulus, the bells are a stimulus, really anything. We are adding a stimulus. Negative means we are removing a stimulus. Punishment means we are attempting to decrease the chances of the behavior happening again. And reinforcement means we are attempting to increase the chances of that behavior happening again. So the 4 quadrants end up being positive reinforcement. We are adding a stimulus to increase the chances of something happening again. Positive punishment, we are adding a stimulus to decrease the chances of something happening again. Negative reinforcement, we are removing a stimulus to increase the chances of a behavior happening again. And negative punishment, we are removing a stimulus to decrease the chances of a behavior happening again. And those are the 4 quadrants in operant conditioning. If you've heard of positive reinforcement training, that comes from operant conditioning. Operant conditioning and classical conditioning are two of the most talked about things, although they might not be used in those words when it comes to animal training, especially dog training. And I put that under behavior modification. These things can be used for emotional modification. However, as a lot of other horse trainers will tell you, or really any trainers, you can't reinforce feelings. The animal just has feelings. You can reinforce behaviors, but you can't reinforce feelings. So giving a treat to a dog that is scared is not going to tell them that that being scared is good, right? So operant conditioning is primarily a behavior focused. You can use operant conditioning and strategies from within it to help alter the emotions, but it is inherently a behavior focused conditioning model. So when we talk about emotional modification, this is where classical conditioning comes into play. Classical conditioning, the most famous experiment on it was Pavlov's dogs by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov in 1897-ish. So this is when he noticed that when he fed his dogs, they salivated in anticipation of the food, and so he started ringing a bell before he fed them, and shortly after that, they started salivating at the sound of the bell. So in kind of psychological terms, what's happening is you're taking a neutral stimulus that has no reaction for the dogs, the bell, and a natural stimulus, the food, that naturally causes a reaction in the dogs, which is the salivating. And you're pairing them together so that the neutral stimulus becomes a learned stimulus, and the dogs will salivate at the bell. This usually, to me, falls under emotional modification, because even though that example sounds like behavior, it's the emotion and the excitement of the dogs getting fed. And this is one where you'll see a lot of classical conditioning in like giving treats to puppies when they're first getting their grooming sessions and things like that. So they associate the grooming with good things. That would be classical conditioning. Related to classical conditioning is a term called extinction. And this is when you unpair the learned stimulus and the natural stimulus enough times that the animal will no longer react to the learned stimulus. So if we just rang the bell constantly without feeding the dogs, eventually they would stop salivating at the bell. Extinction is really kind of it can be used as a form of desensitization, and you'll see some use of extinction and variations of extinction in like phobia therapy. And this brings us down to desensitization. Desensitization is where you do a lot of things and you expose your animal to a lot of things so that they don't react to those situations. This is super common with puppies as part of their early puppy training protocols. It is also super talked about with horses. There are entire clinics where you take your horse to a field that has curtains made with pool noodles and tarps and water to walk through and tons of stuff for them to walk over and touch. People will dress up in dinosaur costumes to desensitize their horse to really any type of scenario you can imagine, including the return of dinosaurs, I guess. So this would fall under emotional modification, in which we are desensitizing the horse so that they do not have an emotional reaction to these scenarios. Now, a couple non-psychological terms that I want to talk about that you'll hear a lot in animal training is force-free. Force-free can refer to using methods that do not make an animal uncomfortable, but force-free can also refer to, and some people use it this way, even things like a common method of training a dog to sit is you put pressure on its butt to have it sit down. That would not be allowed under this definition of force-free because the pushing on the butt is a form of force. The way that when people use force-free with that, where you do not put pressure on the animal at all, you will never find a horse that is trained that way. Because all horses are trained with pressure release. All horses are trained with pressure release. So this is where, when you hear someone say that my horse moves off of pressure, an animal gives to pressure, that's pressure release. Pressure release is a form of training where you essentially push on the horse to indicate, or push on an animal to indicate where you want it to go, and the animal goes in that direction. This is different than a lot of dog training. For instance, working huskies cannot be trained with complete pressure release because the pressure of them pulling on the harness and the sled, if they were full pressure release trained, they would not pull on the sled. That's kind of what pressure release is. If they were trained in full pressure release, the pressure on their chest would make them stop. Pressure release is inherently negative reinforcement. The act of applying pressure is uncomfortable for the horse. So the pressure is uncomfortable, and then when the horse behaves the way you want, you release the pressure. The releasing of the pressure is the reinforcement. Therefore, this is inherently negative reinforcing because we are removing the stimulus, which is the pressure, to reinforce the horse, which is the release. So all pressure release is inherently negative reinforcement and can't be force-free. Some people have tried to say that pressure release is just a cue behavior training, where they are simply training the horse that the pressure is the cue and that the release is not reinforcing. This is not possible unless you go through and completely desensitize your horse to any natural reaction to pressure. If you do that, and then reteach pressure and release as a cue, then you can say that pressure and release was force-free. But I've never heard of anyone that has done that. So unless they tell you that they have gone through the full desensitization process with this pressure and release is going to be inherently negative reinforcement. And again, this is not to say that this is bad, right? These words do not mean good or bad. They are simply the psychological explanation for what is happening and why this training works. That's what we're talking about. So, these are the overview of the definitions that we are going to talk about. Next week, we're going to go in depth on classical conditioning and extinction, and more about what that is, how it works, a little bit of the history, and what makes it work, and the different ways that we can use it when working with animals. So, hope that was helpful. Hope everything was clear. Let me know if you have any questions, and we will see you next Friday.